My name is Paul Hutchcroft. I'm Director of the School of International Political and Strategic Studies in the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the ANU. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening to a public lecture by Professor Ezra Vogel of Harvard University. This event originated in some conversations that Ezra and I had at the annual conference of the Association for Asian Studies some 15 months ago, anticipating the late 2011 publication of his book on Deng Xiaoping and the transformation of China. We in the School of International Political and Strategic Studies, or IPS, then teamed up with other units in the College of Asia and the Pacific, namely the Australian Centre for China in the World and the Research School of Asia and the Pacific, which has welcomed Professor Vogel as part of its Distinguished Visitors Program. We want to thank the ANU and CAP media offices for their support, and I most of all want to express our collective gratitude to Ms. Olivia Cable of IPS for the extraordinary energy she has put into organizing a full week of events, the centerpiece of which is this public lecture. I'll soon be turning over the rostrum to Professor Jeremy Barmay, the director of CIW, who will introduce our speaker. Before doing so, I just want to add a quick personal note. There is at times a negative correlation between the professional stature of a scholar and his or her willingness to take time to nurture younger academics in the field. This is most certainly not the case with Professor Vogel, whom I have known since my affiliation with the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies some 20 years ago. Ezra always took time to support and encourage the junior scholars of the Academy, and in my case, I had the good fortune to work with him years later in a collaborative work on Pak Chung-hee of South Korea, recently published by Harvard University Press. Professor Vogel is indeed a man who combines remarkable professional achievements with sterling personal qualities, not to mention a disarming humility. I now invite Professor Jeremy Barmay to provide this evening's introduction.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'll keep my remarks very short because I know we're all anxious to hear Ezra. It's an extraordinary moment to have Ezra here. As you know, this is a week that commemorates one of the modern tragedies of China, the June 4th week. Ezra's book, which is an extraordinary, monumental, and incredibly judicious study of Deng Xiaoping's life, in particular his latter years, concentrates in particular on that period and provides one of the most extraordinarily even-handed and judicious approaches to this day, highly controversial, highly contested moment in Chinese history. My own engagement with Ezra's work goes back to my early years in Japan in the 1980s when Japan was number one, and Ezra was the person who identified its possibilities, its problems, its trajectory. He was also a person who, ahead of his time, saw the trajectory of Guangdong province, the place that, again, in his extraordinary book, and I'd recommend you read the Deng Xiaoping work. It's a very heavy and large text, but nonetheless, it's absolutely worth the effort. Guangdong is the place where Deng Xiaoping went in 1992 to reignite the economic thrust of China's modernization program. A moment in Chinese history, like June 4th, monumental, important, controversial to this day. This year also is a commemoration of that 1992 trip by Deng Xiaoping to the south. Ezra had done groundbreaking work on Guangdong and the Guangdong model, what is still a contested, debated model in Chinese politics today. The 1992 trip, when Deng Xiaoping made a series of both off-the-cuff and slightly more considered remarks about economic reform, about ideology and about politics, about the direction of China, continues to resonate today, in particular because those of you who've been following Chinese contemporary events will be aware that some of the very issues that Deng Xiaoping engaged with in 1992, that is, should China lurch back to the left, to the Maoist models of mass mobilization and charismatic leadership, or should it pursue a more neoliberal economic model in its development, have been at the center of debate in China, in particular since February and March this year. So reading Ezra's book is not only reading an extraordinarily judicious historical account of one of the great figures of the 20th century, it is also a textbook on understanding China right now and today. I'm also delighted to be here because I have my good colleague Richard Rigby, who's the head of the China Institute here at the ANU and an adjunct director of our Australian Centre on China and the World, which was founded by the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And we're also joined by another former Prime Minister, one who, as I was saying a moment ago, we remember fondly and long for in so many ways, Bob Hawke, a figure of extraordinary importance in the Australian-China relationship, somebody who, with colleagues here at the ANU as well, in particular Ross Garneau, were among the architects of an extraordinary engagement with that country, starting with Gough Whitlam in particular, after the normalisation of relations, which was being celebrated in its 40th year this year. But Bob Hawke was one of those figures who engaged with China and its leaders in a way that was compelling, long-term, insightful, and profound. The impact of that continues to resonate with our daily lives in Australia today. I was also delighted to have the opportunity to interpret for the former Prime Minister twice. In 1985 for him and Hu Yaobang. I was in a booth, so you probably you would have heard my voice, but you wouldn't know who I was. Richard was sitting next to you at the time. And again, a very memorable dinner at the Great Hall of Parliament House in 1988 for Li Peng and your good self. On Li Peng, Premier Li Peng's first official visit overseas as the Premier of China. A grumpy man is all I can say about the Premier. And at that time, we were aware that there were ructions in the Chinese leadership, and some of us thought things would not go well in 1989. Sadly, we were all too right. I'm also delighted on this occasion. We have our Vice-Chancellor here. Paul Hutchcroft has been very generous in his introduction. We also have our colleagues for the Contemporary China Centre, Jonathan Unger and also Anita Chan. Jonathan Unger is an old friend of Ezra's and has played a great role in the study of China in this university. And he's also a constant supporter of an incredibly important figure in our study and understanding of Deng Xiaoping and in Ezra's work, Warren Sun, who's here in the audience today. Warren, who's affiliated with the ANU but attached to Monash University, is we regard him as the living repository of knowledge about contemporary Chinese politics. It's ins and it's outs, mostly it's ins, the complex, bizarre, arcane, labyrinthine world of Chinese politics from really, well, the 20th century, but in particular in the People's Republic era from 1949 onwards. I know that Ezra often sought Warren's advice. I seek his advice and counsel and understanding of the chicanery and bizarre doings of Chinese politics today. We're also working on a project together. So it's wonderful to have him in the audience today. Also in the audience, I just finished by just saying I'm also delighted that we have our first CIW, Australian Centre on China and the World, visiting professor from Harvard, a colleague of Ezra's, Mark Elliott, who is visiting our centre, and he will be giving this year's Morrison Lecture. It's the George E. Morrison Lecture, which was founded in 1932. It's the 73rd annual George E. Morrison Lecture, which will be here in the Coombs building on the 20th of June. And with those words, I would like to thank Ezra for coming, and please invite him to the podium.
Is this mic adequate? If people in the back row can't hear, let me know. It's a special pleasure to be here today for many reasons. One is that about 10 years ago when I was starting out working on Deng, John Unger invited me here. And at that time I was able to have interviews with former Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Richard Rigby and a number of the people who got me on the right direction and learning a lot about Deng just as I was beginning the project. It's also a special pleasure because Warren Sun is in the audience. And in my view, there is no person outside of China who has more detailed information about the periods we're studying than Warren Sun. And I've relied on him very heavily, and he was kind enough to come spend some months with me going over my manuscript, help me avoid some errors, and put me on the right path to a lot of other things. It's also a special pleasure because I think this new center, the China and the World, that's under Jeremy's direction, and has been helped by former Prime Minister Rudd, is the largest single grant in Chinese studies that I can remember. And I think in the global study of China, since the time when we were first developing modern Chinese studies around 1960-61, since that time it may have the potential to be one of the biggest developments in Chinese studies around the world. And I think all of us have great expectations and for the particular approach that Jeremy is bringing of the broad Chinese civilization, cutting boundaries between disciplines, between time periods, and providing an overall perspective. I also want to thank Paul Hutchcroft, my good friend, who, in my view, is one of the world's leaders in Southeast Asian studies, and who has been so helpful personally in arranging this visit. When I was turning 70, I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life if I grew up, and that I was thinking that we academics, particularly at Harvard, but at many other institutions, who receive grants from foundations that are national or global and from our countries, have an obligation beyond our own students. And I had been teaching our students for a long time, and I thought toward the end of my career, I think that particularly senior scholars have a responsibility to try to provide a more integrated picture. So many young scholars have to work so hard to do a highly specialized study. I think one of the problems in the field is that there aren't many people who try to provide an overview. And I thought, what kind of overview could be helpful in the understanding of contemporary China? And I thought that perhaps the most important thing was to understand the nature of reform and opening and Deng Xiaoping that set China on its new course. I started out as a sociologist, but some people now call me a historian simply because I've lived so long, and what I started out as studying as society has now become history. What I want to do today is not try to summarize all the 750 pages of text in my book, but to highlight one particular aspect that I think is crucial for our understanding of the outsider to this period of Deng Xiaoping from 78 to 92, and that is how Deng got interested in the idea of learning from abroad, and what he did in the course of his life in terms of meeting people from different countries, and how he used that to help shape the opening of China and the contact with the outside world. The first picture we have of Deng is at 16 years old. He had already arrived in France. And some people in China during World War I had developed the idea that since there were not scholarships available for Chinese abroad, that they would send some bright young people abroad to work part-time and to study. And that they would use the money that they earned working and use it to study and bring back the modern developments around the world, science, technology, management, to help China. And the problem was that this was conceived during World War I. And during World War I, there were something like 150,000 Chinese workers in France. There seemed to be a lot of opportunities to work there. And so they arranged a scholarship program. They hadn't thought of the possibility that at the end of the war, there would be a lot of French young men coming back from the war. And of course, they had not anticipated what they found when Deng arrived in 1920, and that is that France was already suffering from depression. And so these bright young people who had passed examinations, who thought they were going to be able to study, found out that they had a very hard time getting any kind of job. And when they met and started discussion groups among these students in France, and there were probably more Chinese students at that point in France than any other country in the world, It's partly because so many workers had gone there during World War I, but also because many people in China thought of it as a great civilization, a great opportunity to learn. So when they got there in the 1920s, and they started to meet in little groups, there were perhaps about 2,500 Chinese students in France at the time. They would have these discussions, and what they found as they discussed it was that the Russian Revolution that had occurred just a few years before and was getting a lot of attention relied on Marxism-Leninism. And when they thought about their own circumstances, and somebody said, well, the capitalists are exploiting the workers, and they looked around and they saw a lot of rich families and rich homes and a lot of poor workers in the factory conditions that were responding to market conditions at the time, early stage industry. And then they found out that the Chinese or foreign workers were at the very bottom of the pile, and they got the worst and dirtiest jobs, and that it made sense to them that the imperialist countries were exploiting the workers. In the period of the Civil War in China in the late 40s and World War II, those who had studied in France and gone back to the Communist Party were not necessarily people who had important positions. But as they started trying to begin to modernize the country in the 40s and 50s, and particularly after Deng came to power, those who had studied in France played very key roles in foreign affairs, science, economic development. And here in this picture of the little communist youth group in 1924, you see several people who later played very important positions. Of course, Zhou Enlai was about 6 years older than Deng, right there in the middle, was really the leader of this group. At the very left end, the way you're facing, is Nie Jun, who played a very key role in scientific development, especially in the national defense sector. A couple to the right of Zhou Enlai there is Li Fuchun, who played a very key role in the 1950s and even later in economic development. And back there in the back row, standing on a bench about third from right, is Deng Xiaoping. If you look at these people, you may wonder, how they became the representative of the workers and the peasants. They don't look like people who just got out of the gutter or just came out of tenant farmery. In order to pass the exams to get to Europe, they had to have pretty good education. In order to have that education, they had to come from families that could afford it. And so here they are, the vanguard of the revolution as they saw themselves, forming Communist Party organizations and getting ready to lead workers and peasants in what they hoped would eventually lead to the rebuilding of China. After 1949, when Mao came to power and unified the country, for the first 3 years, Deng was down in the southwest part of China, where he was head of the Southwest China Bureau. And he had experience in trying to build the roots. But after 1952, he and the leaders from a lot of other regions were brought to Beijing. And at this time, Deng already had a lot of responsibilities. He was brought on, he was already known to Mao in the 1930s. And the first time of the 3 times he stumbled and fell out of office was in the 1930s in the Jiangxi period when he was accused of leading a Mao faction. So this brought him a special kind of binding with Mao way back in the 1930s. And so after 1952, Deng, who had great ability, was seen by Mao as a person of great potential leader. He was brought under the Politburo in 1955, onto the Standing Committee in 1956. And during this time, he already began to play a very key role in meeting foreign visitors. Of course, this was the height of the Cold War, and the foreign visitors they met were from the Soviet Union and from the communist parties of Asia and the communist countries of Eastern Europe. So here is Mao visiting Moscow in 1957 when he made the famous speech talking about the east wind winning out over the west wind. And at the far left, as you see, the young man that Mao said at that time had a great future was Deng Xiaoping, and so was already very much involved in meeting leaders of the communist world. Here he is in 1960 with Khrushchev in Moscow. In 1956, Deng was also in Moscow when Khrushchev made the famous speech criticizing Mao. And Deng realized that the totally devastating picture that he painted of Stalin not only gave a bad reputation to Stalin, but anybody who worked with him. And nearly everybody who was an important leader in the Soviet Union had worked with Stalin. So it greatly destroyed the entire authority of the party. And it was clear to Deng that if China should ever criticize a leader, they should not do it in that kind of devastating, total way that would ruin the authority of leaders who survived and who were leading their country at a later time. Here's just one example of the Asian people that Deng Xiaoping met. This is in 1960 with Uncle Ho, who was in France at the same time Deng was, and had become quite friendly with Deng in the 1940s in Yunnan. It was, of course, a long time before 1979 when Deng led the invasion of Vietnam. And it was at a time when their common interests against the imperialists united them more than the national interests, which differed at a later period of time. Deng Xiaoping is usually recorded in China in sources as being 5 feet tall. Some people say he was really only 4 feet 11. Here he is in Moscow. Here he is in the Beijing airport on the way to Moscow in 1963. And even though he's only 5 feet tall, you can see he doesn't look like he's suffering from an inferiority complex. To his left there is Liu Shaoqi. To his left, behind him a little bit, is Zhou Enlai, and behind his right is Peng Zhen. Deng's second time to go out of power and to be pulled off was in 1966 at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And from 1976 to 1973, Deng was out of it. Mao brought him back in 1973, and the first time he appeared in public in Beijing in 1973 after he came back was an evening supper that Zhou Enlai gave for Sihanouk. Here Deng Xiaoping is at that evening supper, looking as if he's just back to work and nothing particular had happened. He's ready to go back to work. This, I think, is a very poignant and important transition, a picture that, in a way, captures a very basic change in personnel in foreign relations. Until about 1973, of course, Zhou Enlai was the one who dominated foreign relations. After the clash with the Soviet Union in 1969, and the opening that began with the West, was it 1970 that Australia normalized relations with China, Richard? Pardon? 1970? Pardon? End of 72. Then they were beginning to form relations with other countries. And in 1971, China was admitted to the United Nations in the seat that had been occupied by Taiwan. And they expected that a senior Chinese leader should go to the United Nations and make a speech setting out China's policies in the United Nations. Logically, the person who should have done that, who deserved to do it, was Zhou Enlai, because Zhou Enlai had led foreign relations. He had been Deng's superior in the 1920s in France and in the 1930s, and when they were in the underground in Shanghai, and in the early 1950s when Zhou Enlai outranked Mao. But by this time, 1974, Zhou Enlai was already suffering from cancer, and he was also suffering from political illness. Mao had thought he'd been too soft on the United States, and he had not stood up to Kissinger properly in defending China's interests. He was too willing to consider all kinds of things that would not have been in China's interest, and he felt that Deng had been very tough in his arguments with Suslov and other Soviet leaders, would be a much stronger leader. So here, in a way, is Zhou Enlai passing on responsibility for international relations to his tutee, Deng Xiaoping, who then goes to the United Nations to give the first major speech on behalf of mainland China in the United Nations. Here Deng is giving the speech. Here he is up close. In that time, while he was in New York, he met Kissinger for the first time. Of course, when Kissinger and then also Nixon came to China, Nixon in 1972 and Kissinger a number of times, Deng was out because of the Cultural Revolution, so the first time they met was in 1974. Kissinger wrote at the time that compared to Zhou Enlai, whom he considered a wonderful diplomat, that Deng Xiaoping seemed to be on a training mission. But in a way, I think that's a bit unfair because Deng was quite concerned. He'd just come back working under Mao. He was very concerned about what Mao might say, what Mao might think of him, and he was very cautious in what he said. And any kind of big issues came up, he turned to Qiao Guanhua from the Foreign Ministry over to his left. Now, my book focuses heavily on Deng Xiaoping, but of course, one man can't change history. When Deng came back in 1977, again at the end of 75, early 76, he was thrown out for the third time. And Mao, who had much respect for his abilities, felt that Hua Guofeng was more likely to follow the line of being loyal to Mao and his revolutionary line. And so in end of 75, early 76, it was Hua Guofeng who became his successor. In September 1976, when after Mao died, Deng, of course, was out of office, and the question was whether Deng should be allowed to come back to work at all. Since he knew far more about foreign relations than anybody else, when he was brought back a year after Mao's death in August 77, he was, of course, given responsibility for foreign relations, but Deng also volunteered for science, technology, and education work. It would not be too threatening to Hua Guofeng, and furthermore, by concentrating in this area, he thought he was helping pave the way for the modernizations. Zhou Enlai had talked about 4 modernizations, and of those 4, Deng considered science technology by far the most important, compared to modernization of industry, agriculture, and national defense. Deng felt if they got science and technology right and really made progress in that field, that would lead to 4 other modernizations. So already in 77, we're talking about a year and a half before the famous third plenum where the policy of opening and reform started. Before that policy, Deng was already looking ahead to a program of modernization, as were other party leaders. And so Deng calls together all the educators, including the Minister of Education, August 79. This was only several days after he came back to work. And he said, can we reopen universities this year? And can we have entrance examinations? By entrance examinations, Deng meant something different than Mao had meant by entrance exams. Mao had always considered political criteria as very important. And does this person come from the right class background? Worker, peasant, and of course soldiers would get preference. Of course they had entrance examinations, but it was always with political criteria that they decided on the admission to universities. Deng wanted to do it entirely on the basis of ability. He figured that classes had gone bourgeois, people had been eliminated, landlords had been eliminated. It was all Chinese were growing up in a national new environment, and that anybody who could pass the examination should be allowed to be in universities. So it was completely on the criteria of national examinations. Universities had been almost closed from the opening of 1966 until 76. There had been a small group of people who were allowed in special universities, but it was not really university education. And so at this time, Deng calls all these educators together, says, can we have the examinations this year? About 7 million people would be taking examinations, had to decide the subjects, had to decide how to administer the examinations, grade them, prepare the universities to open, and ask the educators, could they do it this year? They talked about all the problems, and those of you who've had experience in university administration, I'm sure the Vice Chancellor understands that things don't always happen immediately in universities. And yet, of course, they point out all those problems. Deng says, is it possible we could do that this year? They said, well, it is possible. And Deng says, we're going to do it. And so by the end of the year, early next year, they had done the examinations and were opening the universities. One advantage that Deng had was that there were a lot of foreign Chinese ethnic scientists living abroad. At the time, there were 3 Nobel Prize winners of Chinese ethnic background in science in the United States. And one of them was Yang Jinning. Here he is meeting with Yang Jinning. One of them is Samuel Ding of MIT. Here he is meeting with Samuel Ding. Here he is with a pair of them, Li Yuanzi and Li Zhongdao. And Deng met with him not just once, but many times. Not only did they speak to him in Chinese, but they had left China shortly after World War II. They knew the situation in China. They were up on top of world science, and so they could give him good advice on what it took to build up science. He was Deng was really believed that science was the real key. Deng married a woman who had, in the 1930s, had been admitted at Peking University and studied physics, which was, as you can imagine, not common in those days. And of his 5 children, the oldest one, sickly, was considered not well enough to study science, so she did art and music. One daughter went into medicine. 3 of them passed exams to go to physics at Peking University. I think that gives some idea of how important Deng regarded science and technology as paving the way for a modern country. Here he is meeting. Deng also met with a lot of other intellectuals. Here he is meeting one of the famous linguists, Zhou Enlai. I show this picture not because of Zhou Enlai, but because that lady on the right, his daughter, Iris Bien, taught Chinese at Harvard for many years, and I suffered first-year Chinese under her close tutelage. Of course, Deng needed the support of a lot of other people, and since Deng had been abroad to visit the United Nations in '74 and gone on to France that year, and as a state visitor to France the next year, '75, he had a pretty good idea that foreign countries had really advanced a lot. But to really get broad-level support for modernization efforts, he needed a much broader base of support. And I'm surprised that somehow in the Western literature we have not given more attention to these delegations of Chinese who went abroad. Those of you who studied Japanese history know how important the Iwakura mission was in the early Meiji period as a basis for getting not only arousing consciousness, but leading connections to foreign countries and getting people prepared. So this delegation, Gumu, was the most important of the delegations that went abroad in 1978. And of course, it was not just Deng, it was Hua Guofeng who supported the sending of these delegations abroad at that time. This delegation, the Gumu, spent 5 weeks in Germany, Switzerland, Germany, France, Belgium, and Holland. They included people in the Construction Commission, Planning Commission, Economic Commission, all the major industrial ministries. university education sector, shipbuilding, mining, and they were young enough so that after they took this tour and visited appropriate facilities abroad, they could begin to take leadership roles. So this group and their new raised consciousness helped provide the broader support when Deng began opening modernization policy at the third plenum in December. And when they came back to Beijing, this group came back to report. They were supposed to meet for a couple hours or so one afternoon to report to the highest level of political leaderships. They started at 3 and they ended at midnight. And what they reported was that they had been completely wrong in their estimates of foreign science and technology. They had been victims of their own propaganda, saying how much socialism had accomplished. And what they found out is that the other countries are just way ahead of China. They also were surprised to learn that the European countries were ready to lend them money to help get started, and were willing to spend a lot of time teaching them and welcoming their students to study science and technology. So this group and other groups like that went to Hong Kong and Japan and elsewhere helped provide a broader basis for support when the modernization drive began in December. Oops, sorry. Here's Deng talking to Gu Mu. At the work conference in November-December 1978, a number of party leaders decided that Hua Guofeng could not provide the overall top leadership that was necessary to lead modernization. Some people felt he was too close to Mao. Others felt that he had no experience abroad. He had met foreign leaders. He also did not have experience in the army. He did not have the broad experience in all parts of the Chinese bureaucracy and party leadership that Deng had, and the self-assurance that Deng displayed in 74, 75, when under Mao he had quite a bit of responsibility before he was purged for the third time. So these group of top leaders decided at this work conference that Deng should emerge as the top leader and the preeminent leader. However, they remembered that Mao in the Yan'an period had been quite open to ideas, but after 49, when he became chairman of this and chairman of that, and had all the top positions, and children learned ditties and he was treated like a god, that they could not correct the errors. In their analysis of what went wrong in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, it was not just that Mao had made many serious errors, but that the system was such that people who had different ideas and wanted to raise objections couldn't. So they decided that Deng would be called vice premier, but not premier. He would be called deputy chairman of the party, but not chairman. And also they decided that one other person be given about the same position and status within the party that he was. And the one person they chose was a person who also had a period of high positions in the party, at least as long as Deng. He'd been on the Central Committee even before Deng was, had played a major role in economic recovery after 1949, leading the first five-year plan, and who was deeply respected within the party, that is Chen Yun. So although Deng was the spokesman, became the spokesman for the party, here are the two leaders at the third plenum in December 1978, preparing and delivering their basic directions. As Warren Sun has pointed out, Hua Guofeng also played a major role in modernization, was not really as much against modernization as some of the things published in China would lead one to believe. But certainly Deng and Chen Yun were pushing ahead with reform and opening. 2 months before Deng opened the relations the Reform and Opening, he went to Japan. In roughly 2,500 years since Chinese and Japanese had been having some level of contact, the first time that a Chinese leader met the Emperor of Japan was in October 78 when Deng went there. They had lunch for a couple hours, and Deng later reported that Emperor Hirohito apologized for the horrible tragedies that had been brought by World War II and resolved to avoid those kind of things in the future, said we should never allow those kind of things to happen. And what Deng's visit to Japan was not only intended to get Japanese to be willing and help Chinese, but also to have these pictures play back in China so that the Chinese who still hated Japan because of World War II would be willing to learn from them and feel that the things have changed sufficiently so that we can now learn from Japan in science and technology and have close enough relationships to be forward-looking about building up the country. Here is Deng visiting perhaps the most modern steel plant of the world at the time, Kimitsu, which became the basis for Baoshan, the first modern steel plant, with heavy Japanese aid, encouragement, and teaching and financing that enabled the Chinese to develop that at Baoshan. Deng was reported not to be very talkative, as the Chinese say, 不爱说话. He wasn't overly loquacious, and when people asked him, for the first time a Chinese leader had ridden on a fast train, what it was like, Deng's reply was, 很快, very fast. Here he is meeting Tanaka, Prime Minister Tanaka. And 1 month before the December, Deng went to Southeast Asia and went to Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And here he is meeting Lee Kuan Yew, 19 years younger. Not many of you are old enough to remember that way back in the 1950s, a lot of us at universities were debating, why is it that Chinese tradition makes it so difficult for modernization and that no ethnic Chinese had ever modernized? But by the time Deng went to see Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore had already done a lot of modernization, was ethnic Chinese group, and of course that was very he was when Deng met Gokung Svi on that visit, and Gokung Svi said he used one word to describe Deng's reaction: flabbergasted. He was just flabbergasted at the economic progress that this place had made, and clean streets, well organized. They were starting industry. It was beginning to grow and modernize. And I think although Lee Kuan Yew grew up in Western English language schools, of course he knew a lot more about China than the other foreign leaders that Deng met. And they formed quite a deep relationship. When I interviewed Lee Kuan Yew about his relationship with Deng, he said that Deng was the most impressive foreign leader he ever met. And he met a lot of them from the time of World War II up until the present time. And he said what was particularly impressive is that he inherited a system that he knew was not working, and he was willing to consider a completely different new system and then figure out how to get from here to there. When President Carter was elected in 1977, he already intended to normalize relations with China. Although Nixon had gone to China and opened up relations, the effort to normalize relations, to have embassies and consulates and all the dealings with all kinds of issues that would enable countries to really work closely together, had not yet been completed. So when Carter got to be president in 1977, he wanted to normalize relationships with China. Within days after Deng came to power, the American Secretary of State Vance was in Beijing visiting. But at that time, Vance was not yet ready. Carter was not yet ready to start the normalization talks. But in May 78, Deng was met by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been sent by Carter to announce that we're now ready to begin the discussions for normalization. America, of course, had a liaison office in Beijing at the time, and Carter sent to head that liaison office Leonard Woodcock, and the reason he sent him is he was a great negotiator. He negotiated between labor and management and had the trust of both sides, was considered a strong but fair negotiator, and also he had a lot of friends in Congress, so that if they normalized relationships, Woodcock could help get support. So during the fall of 1978, Woodcock and various Chinese officials, particularly Huang Hua, who was right there in the middle, conducted most of those negotiations. But in the very end, the last stage of the difficult negotiations, they were between Deng and Woodcock. Here they are toasting the completion of those negotiations in December 1978. When we were talking about inviting a Chinese leader to the United States, because Hua Guofeng still was called a chairman and premier, the United States government was a little cautious about specifying which leader would be invited. And so Woodcock had said to Deng, the United States is prepared to welcome a Chinese leader to celebrate normalization. Deng said, I'm happy to accept the invitation. How about next month? And the next month he was in Washington talking with Carter, and here they are. As a Harvard man, I'm happy to report that the guy in the middle attended Harvard 1948 to 1950, Ji Chaozhou, before he went back to China and later became a leading interpreter. He was Deng's main interpreter during that Deng was traveling around the United States. Here they are on the steps of the White House. Here they are signing normalization agreement. After President Nixon was unceremoniously removed from the White House in Watergate, Nixon had never been allowed to return to the White House. But when Deng was coming, he said to Carter, he passed the word to Carter, in China we have an expression that means when you drink the water, you should remember who built the well. And on the United States side, the guy who built the well of normalizing U.S.-China relations was Nixon. So therefore, we would like Nixon to be invited to the White House. So Carter invites Nixon, and here they are happily talking the first time Nixon got back in the White House after Watergate. Here is our unruly Congress that we've learned to live with, if not love. And after Deng visited the White House, he went over to Congress. And you can see that little guy Deng standing in the middle. And to your left is Ji Chaozhou, the interpreter. And to his left is sitting down as a white-haired, plump old member of Congress, Tip O'Neill, who is the Speaker of the House. And Deng and Tip O'Neill had about an hour conversation, had a great time. They hit it off beautifully, and Tip went to China the next year as a guest of Deng Xiaoping. But in the conversation, Tip O'Neill was entertaining with stories of how Congress fights the White House and telling one story after another. And then he ended by saying, we believe that's a very good system where there is a check and balance, and that makes for a very good country. And Deng's final words, it wouldn't work in China. He wanted a strong, centralized authority and not to have authority divided between executive, legislative, and judicial. Deng then toured the United States. He went to Atlanta. Here he is seeing modern Ford plant. Here he is in Texas in a rodeo where there's Ji Chaozhou with a cowboy hat in back of him. And a cowgirl rides up and presents a hat to Deng, and then he puts it on. And this picture had a terrific impact in the United States. I think the typical American reaction was, oh, maybe he's a communist, but he looks like he's human, and it looks like a guy we might be able to work with. But Orville Schell, who is an American journalist who knew Chinese and was at this event, and he wrote that this picture had an even bigger impact in China, because in a way it said to the Chinese public when this picture was played that all this stuff about imperialism that we've been teaching you for all these years, don't worry so much about it. It's all right to imbibe American culture, American life. And so this picture became a symbol for the new era on both sides. Here is Deng had such a good time writing on this replica of the moon launch vehicle in Houston. Here is in the Normalisation in March when Secretary Blumenthal came to open the American embassy in China officially. Here is a picture of the right-hand man of Deng Xiaoping during these eras, Hu Yaobang, who was a wonderful general secretary who was very popular. And here he is visiting Australia in 1985, seeing Bob Hawke showing him. I remember Bob telling me that when he talked to Hu Qili about this and asked Hu Qili how he felt when Hu Yaobang talked, his answer was terrified. Hu Yaobang was a very free-spoken kind of person. This is 1985. In January 1987, after the big student movement, Deng Xiaoping and other high-level party leaders threw Hu Yaobang out of office. And the funeral ceremonies when Hu Yaobang died, in a way, were the things that set off the Tiananmen demonstrations in 1989. Here we are, George Bush Sr. meeting Deng, and I think of all the American leaders, the one who had perhaps the closest contact with Deng was George Bush Sr. That is because in 1975, when Deng had leadership responsibilities, the head of the American Liaison Office in Beijing was George Bush Sr. So they had a lot of contact at that time and hit it off. When Reagan was running for president, he said that Taiwan should be recognized, and that did not make Deng very happy about that statement. So it took a while, I think, until Bush and others quieted him down and acknowledged that they would not normalize relations with Taiwan. And that enabled Reagan to go to Beijing. And here is President Reagan in Beijing, who later commented he didn't seem like a communist. In 1982, Maggie Thatcher went to England, went to Beijing to tell Deng about the problems of Hong Kong. Businessmen were getting worried. It was 15 years until the new territories were scheduled to go back to China, and the fear was that banks and others extending loans would have increasing difficulties, and they needed to move quickly to resolve the issues about Hong Kong. It was so soon after the Cultural Revolution, which really ended in '76, that a lot of people in Hong Kong, not just the British, but a lot of Hong Kong Chinese ethnic business people, felt that they didn't think that the communists in Beijing could lead a modern, industrial, worldwide financial center like Hong Kong, and they're really deeply worried. So Thatcher went with a proposal that, sovereignty could go back to China perhaps in 1997 of this area, and maybe even all of Hong Kong, but that it would be best to be administered by British civil servants. Deng did not consider that a basis of negotiation. He felt that it should all be administered by China, and he told her so. Some of you may have seen a movie called The Iron Lady, because Thatcher is, of course, known as the Iron Lady. And within China, some people called Deng the Steel Factory. And so here the Iron Lady and the steel factory are having a discussion about the future. And on the way out, going down the steps, Thatcher tripped. And that was caught on Hong Kong television, played over and over again, and played as if the Iron Lady had tripped and yielded under the strong pressure of the steel factory. They then began a couple of years of serious negotiations, and here they are meeting again 2 years later, happily, after the joint declaration had been agreed on. And the essence of the joint declaration was, of course, the one country, two systems, that China would pass over not only sovereignty but administration, and that, however, they would be allowed, Hong Kong would be allowed to keep its basic system, capitalism, other institutions, for at least a half a century and perhaps even more. It's sort of hard for me to imagine that American, I don't know how about Australia, that a leader would negotiate something 50 years later on and would have, for America, long term is beyond the next election. So here was Deng thinking it would take about a half a century for the two places to grow together, and sort of making that agreement. Deng wanted China in all kinds of international organizations as a way not only to learn about the outside world, but participation would require that China would make changes that he and later Zhu Enlai and others thought were really very good for China. Here is Deng meeting McNamara, the head of the World Bank. Here he is meeting the head of the World International Monetary Fund. I can see that some of you are old enough to remember that before Wikipedia, we had things called encyclopedias. And in 1979, Deng thought that by getting the Encyclopedia Britannica translated into Chinese, it would be one quick way for a lot of Chinese people to have access to knowledge around the world. So here's Frank Gibney negotiating the translation rights for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Here, I've gone through records as nearly as I can, all in the input of Deng, the chronology meetings. I can't remember where he met any delegation headed by an economist. But he loved to talk to political leaders and business leaders. And so people who had real responsibility for running things. So he met lots of business leaders, and here he is with some Macau, Hong Kong leaders. Here he is with a Hong Kong business leader, Li Ka-shing. Here he is meeting with An Wang, and An Wang was then head of a computer company. So just as Deng could learn about science from Nobel Prize Chinese Americans, so he could learn about the information age from An Wang, who could help brief him about sort of the new forthcoming developments in computer and information science. In February 1989, George Bush was in Beijing meeting Deng. And I think all of you here probably know the context of the spring of 1989 that ended on June 4th. And that is that the Gorbachev made a visit to Beijing and arrived in the middle of May. And Deng had said for some years that if the Soviet Union would pull out of Afghanistan and pull back troops from near the northern border, and if Vietnam would pull out its troops from Cambodia, that he would welcome Soviet leaders to try to patch up relations. And so Deng, who had gone to Moscow in '63 and fought with Suslov, and that really led to the real breach in the relationships, was 26 years later able to say, 36 years later, it was 26 years, 63 to 89, 26 years later, he was able to say that now we've restored relationships. And that was big enough and important enough that Deng was ready to invite the press from around the world. So the press from around the world arrived, and of course, what they found was that there were a lot of students upset with political problems. In a way, what happened, what seemed to me the perfect storm. There were a lot of people in the city who were very upset about inflation, which had grown so high in 1988, and then the efforts to release prices in August 1988 had scared so many people they had to back down. And in addition, a lot of students at that time were passing exams to get into the universities, but they didn't yet have the choice of deciding where they would go, and they were upset because there were a lot of political commissar types around with the students to report on what they did, and that would affect their assignments after graduation. So there was a lot of a feeling among the students that they were living under a totalitarian system that they didn't like. And in addition, there were people in Beijing who felt that there could be a lot more things done. And the foreign press had assembled. And of course, the foreign press had encouraged all these student movements, and they believed that democracy was happening. And around Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, there were a lot of demands for democracy. And so the foreign journalists, as well as a lot of people there, also felt that there were things that could be done, that China needed to have some real changes in its system. Deng, on May 20th, sent in troops who were unarmed to try to restore order. But there was such widespread opposition that the troops were stopped. And the troops were not even properly briefed about what they would do if they were stopped. It was just stunning setback. And so the troops were pulled back. And on June 3rd, the troops and fully armed were told to move back in and do what is ever necessary to restore order. Here's the famous picture of the tanks moving in with the young man trying to block the tanks. So a lot of people who didn't follow the injunction to stay off the streets were there trying to block the troops from coming in, who had been told to do what's necessary, and of course they shot lots of people. There are various estimates of how many people were killed. Tim Brooke, a scholar who is now at the University of British Columbia, was in Beijing and tried to go around to the hospitals and talk to various people who knew, and estimates perhaps 700-800 people were killed. George Bush at the time wrote, I think, a very touching letter to Deng. He said, "I'm writing you because you and I became acquainted in 1975, and we have a lot of trust. I want you to know that America is imposing sanctions, not because we want to harm China, but because we believe so deeply in the cause of human rights and democracy that should be part of our national policy. But it's been so hard in the 50s and 60s to try to establish relations. Finally, we've established relations. We have to do something to keep open relations, despite the fact that we are imposing sanctions. And I want to send a messenger, a high-level messenger, to Beijing." Deng said, responded within a day, send the messenger. And so Scowcroft, our national security advisor, went to Beijing and met Deng to try to keep open relations after Tiananmen. This is a picture of Deng that was circulated after that time. Stay calm, don't get excited. The foreign people are imposing sanctions. But before a few years, a lot of foreign businessmen will say, we need to get into the China market, and they will convince their governments to begin to reduce sanctions. And within a few, the Westerners have a short memory span, and within a few years, things will be okay. And so, in the meantime, just stay calm. In the fall of 1992, Deng was happy that Jiang Zemin was again pushing a policy of pushing reform and opening. And so at the Party Congress, 88 years old, he's waving goodbye. Here he is up close, stepping down from the political stage at age 88. After he retired in 1992, he walked around his garden. Didn't take a lot of activity in politics. He died in 1997. Here is the picture of the Assembly Hall where the memorial service was held for Deng. Here is Jiang Zemin giving that speech. And here's the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations where Deng had given his speech in 1974 when China joined. Consider him important enough world leader that here's a moment of silence in the United Nations for the passing of Deng Xiaoping. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, great.
Thank you, Ezra. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I would just ask that you wait for the microphone. There's some roving microphones on both sides, and if you could please identify yourself, and please keep comments very short and get to the question as soon as possible. Thank you. Who would like to start? Here we go.
Here comes the mic.
Just wait for the mic. We need the mic to pick it up for the recording. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say that the Transformation of Communist Systems project owes its existence to former Prime Minister Hawke, and I'd just like to acknowledge that. Did Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping have much to say about treatment of minorities, in particular the Tibetan question and the moving of Han Chinese into these areas?
In 1980, Deng allowed Hu Yaobang to go to Tibet and to say to the Tibetans that we overdid it in the Cultural Revolution and we want to make amends. And we want a lot of Han, the dominant majority people, cadres to be pulled out. We want more local people to be in charge of things. We want the outsiders to learn more Tibetan local languages. And it had a huge impact. He brought with him 700-800 people. However, within a few months, the Han cadres in Tibet felt they couldn't do their job anymore, that the local people were too strong and independent and would not listen anymore. And the Tibetans began to demand that not only Tibet be an autonomous region, where not only autonomous in the communist sense, which is probably the leadership of the Communist Party, but really run by Tibetans, much as it had been in the Qing dynasty under Chinese suzerainty. But there was such a reaction in Beijing, and there was such turmoil in Tibet, that the leaders in Beijing felt they could not allow that kind of permissiveness to continue, so they can't clamp down. And I think the lesson that Deng had, and you know, some of the rest of us might have felt maybe they should have tried harder and it could have worked, but at least the lesson that Deng drew and a lot of other party leaders drew is that the only way to keep minority areas under control is to have a firmer communist hand, keep the authority. And now the new effort is to do so by pouring more money into the minority areas and also by trying to push assimilation. More learning of Mandarin instead of, particularly at higher levels, and less of the local level. I think personally it's not working. the local minority areas are so upset about this that there's going to be a terrific strain. And the two areas where there's most strain, of course, are the Uyghurs, where you have Turkish related to the outsiders, and Tibetans, where you have exile community in India that has been effectively represented by the Dalai Lama, who has worldwide popularity. So there are other larger, much larger minority groups, the Zhuang and Guangxi, the Manchus, and so forth. But those are the two that are really the most sensitive. I think Deng really hoped that it would be possible to get a more positive cooperation. But the lessons he drew, given the state of the structure of the party and the possibility the minorities might demand even more freedoms, was that you have to clamp down harder. So after that, he did.
Was there a successful suppression of the memory of Tiananmen within China itself? Because there appears to be a resurgence of it now in terms of what you were saying, in terms of the unrest in the Uyghur area. There's also another type of control, as far as I can see, going on in terms of transmigration, an extensive transmigration, and it's associated with extensive development, and it's development in those areas such as the Uyghur areas. And it's going hand in hand with destruction of some of the older parts of the cities and massive redevelopment and development of enormous condominiums, perhaps very, very large ones, and the displacement of the older settlements within the cities. And it appears to be an effort to break up the older communities and to establish the rule and authority of the Politburo and the central authority?
I agree with you. Do you want my...
Yeah, I'm just wondering about your comments on those observations, please.
There, of course, has been a much higher migration under the Deng period than before. Under the Mao, the paradox is, the Mao talked about revolutionary society. In fact, the communes and the urban household registration system and the factories having people working at that factory and living in compounds, actually under the Mao era, there was a much more tightly controlled local society and much less mobility. The growth of economic opportunities and the coastal regions has led to massive migration of hundreds of millions of people, and the pouring of economic, the last several years, pouring of economic aid into the Western countries and Western areas, and having a lot of new railroads and roads built through there, has led to a lot of mobility and stirring up society everywhere. I think in Tibet particularly, and I assume the same thing is true in Xinjiang, by putting in more funds, then more people migrate in from the outside. In the 1950s, China was sending in lots more cadres to get control over those places. But it's my understanding that the main migration that's happened into Tibet since the 1980s and 90s has been largely by merchants and local people from the Hui and other areas who see new opportunities there. It hasn't been through the increase of cadres. So I think the local areas are being disturbed, and the efforts to assimilate, to get bright young local people to go to universities elsewhere in China to learn Mandarin in order to get ahead, and the economic realities that if a local person really wants to get ahead, to get a higher education or to get a good job in the government structure, he has to operate primarily in Mandarin. So I think it is true that there is a process of very considerable assimilation that's taking place now.
Next question here.
It's an honor to be here, and my question is right now China is going through enormous economic growth after Deng Xiaoping's leadership, and a lot of Chinese students are studying overseas, like in countries like Australia and America and Europe and etc. And I do believe in the not far future, the next generation of Chinese leaders will be the ones who had this Chinese influence, this Western influence on them when they go back to China in the future to lead the country. And my question is, what do you think lies ahead for China and for the world? And what do you think is the right thing and the best thing for the Western world to do in response to this change?
If you think about the foreign experience of Chinese leaderships in various generations, in Deng's generation, there were a certain number of leaders who'd been in France. In the next generation, the Jiang Zemin leadership, there have been quite a few leaders who had been in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, including Jiang Zemin. And even though that may be considered a fellow communist country, there is something, I think, about being in another country that deprovincializes you and gives you broader perspective. The current leadership has had the least experience going abroad. And they were the ones who were in the universities in the early 1960s when the relations with Eastern Europe had been broken and the relation with the West had not yet been opened up. So the engineers now running the country were basically provincials who never had foreign experience. Since that time, there are a number of people coming into the hierarchy who have had foreign experience. I'll give you my hunch. I could be wrong. Well, let me state the figures that I had are, as a year or so ago, there were about 380,000 Chinese students who returned from abroad, and something like 1.3, 1.4 who had gone abroad, and over roughly a third of those had returned. But I think what's going to happen in the future, if you're going to have, say, a provincial party committee, the first party secretary is not going to be one of those who's had the most foreign education. I think there's still a certain sense in which the local people who don't have too much foreign contact are the ones in charge. But I think on that committee, you're going to have one or two who have had lots of foreign experience, who will be able to handle foreign languages and be able to introduce new ideas. So I think in the top leadership positions in the provinces and ministries, what you're likely to see is still leadership by people who've not spent much time abroad. But there will be some people who can put inputs who've had a lot more experience. I think in the broad society, when you have already close to 400,000 who have studied abroad, in terms of business, art, academic, you're going to have lots of positions, and the special effort to get high-level academics from abroad to go back to China, I think is going to mean that a lot of people with foreign degrees are going to have opportunities. But even though there are opportunities, if you have 400,000 people going back, there aren't going to be that many professorships available for all those people. And so I think that some will do very well, and then some will not. Yeah.
I think we have time for just one more question. Leszek?
Thank you. My name is Leszek Bushinsky. I'm in the same school as Paul Hutchcroft. And one impression that I retained from your very informative presentation today is that Deng Xiaoping was a very far-seeing person.
A very
Far-seeing person.
far-seeing person.
Far-seeing. And so did he anticipate the problems that would arise in China if science and technology and education and economic system are all transformed while retaining the same political system?
I agree that Deng was a very far-seeing person, and by having lived in France for 5 years in the 1920s, a year in the Soviet Union, by having seen so much change before World War II, the World War II, the end of colonialism, the battles against colonial powers, the end of colonialism, and the establishment of new regimes. I think he had a very broad perspective, and I think the experience when he was sent down during the Cultural Revolution from 1969 to 73 gave him the chance to think apart from the hustle and bustle of daily affairs about what he would do or what China should do if he had a chance to go back, and he thought he would have a chance to go back to Beijing. So I think he was far-reaching, and he did realize that China would need political change. He wrote in a very early essay while he was in the Soviet Union that the amount of political change a country undertakes depends on the political situation. If the people support it, then they could make changes. And he also realized that as the economy changed, you need to change the political structure to keep up with that. And in 1980, August, when he was sort of setting out his vision for the decade, he put political reform on the agenda. When he ran it, he did feel, however, that when uncertainties or instability arose, that was not the time. And in 1978, in the fall, he supported Democracy Wall. But the next March, when he felt things were getting out of hand, he said, well, you have to keep the leadership of the Communist Party, you have to keep Marxist-Leninism, dictatorship of the proletariat, Mao Zedong thought. If you don't have those, then the place could fall apart. And in 1986, when things looked like they might be more stable, he encouraged Zhao Ziyang to lead an entire program for the study of different kind of political systems. Now, to be sure, one of the things they were studying was what happens to a one-party system if you begin to open up more to voting. Why did this happened late, I think, why did certain systems that turned out to voting, like Singapore, even though you had voting, the one party stayed in power? How would that be possible? And that was a kind of question that a lot of people were investigating. But when the Sioux movements came at the end of '86, he felt that was not the time to make political reform. And so my personal view is that if Deng were alive today, he would have that very high on the agenda. He realized that some political reform was necessary, but he was, as the guy in charge where the buck stopped there, he was very worried about the place falling apart. Hu Yaobang, who was head of the Youth League in the 50s and 60s, led the Youth League, and he encouraged them to be free and open. For Deng, as the guy who was General Party Secretary, the buck stopped there, and he felt an enormous responsibility should things get out of control. And perhaps he was too cautious. Perhaps China would be much stronger and further along if it had had more political reform. All we can do as a scholar is tell you what happened and describe what the situation is now. There's no way to prove historically that he was right or that he was wrong, but that's the way it happened.
I realize that others have questions, but I think we've run out of time in the Q&A session. It's now my pleasure to call on the Vice Chancellor of the ANU, Professor Ian Young, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Well, thank you, Paul, and I have the very great privilege this evening to deliver the vote of thanks to our esteemed speaker, Professor Ezra Vogel. Professor Vogel has this evening provided, I think, an outstanding analysis of the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, under whose leadership China began to achieve the wealth and indeed the power that I think it enjoys today, and undoubtedly will do more so in the future. As we heard, Deng displayed an exceptional capacity to deal with foreign leaders and ensure that China would gain international knowledge, particularly science and technology, as we heard, and indeed to develop the modern business and management techniques we're seeing evolving today. Ezra's presentation, I think, this evening was delivered in a wonderfully relaxed and engaging style, which I certainly enjoyed, and I'm sure all of us did. It was really excellent. Of course, Ezra has a few more strings to his bow than we've seen this evening. Not only is he an eminent scholar of China, but also of Japan, and indeed delivers lectures in both Chinese and the Japanese language, as well as, fortunately for some of us here this evening, English as well. Ezra, I certainly enjoyed your fascinating presentation this evening, and I'm sure everyone else did here as well. And I'd like everyone to join with me in thanking Professor Ezra Vogel for his insights this evening.